The roads east of Avranches filled with traffic that moved faster than anyone in France had seen since 1940. Columns of American armor rolled past hedgerows that still smelled of burned cordite. French villagers stood back at first, watching the dust and steel pass, unsure how long this movement would last or what would cost them next. In towns that had changed hands without ceremony during the occupation, men who had once worn French uniforms watched carefully. Some had fought in 1940 and survived captivity. Others had joined local resistance networks and learned to fight without insignia. They spoke quietly among themselves as the American advance continued without pause. In Le Mans, a former artillery sergeant pointed toward the road where tanks passed through the night. "They are not stopping," he said. Another answered, "Then neither will the Germans." Both understood what speed meant in war. They had seen its absence before. Patton's headquarters issued orders that pushed units beyond expectations set by Allied planners only days earlier. Fuel convoys followed at the edge of feasibility. Bridges were taken intact when possible, repaired when not. French towns that expected days of fighting saw hours instead. Church bells rang without coordination, triggered by rumor as much as confirmation. French veterans gathered in doorways, and cafes reopened for the first time in years. They spoke in fragments, comparing this movement to the retreat of 1940. One said, "Back then, we waited for orders that never came." Another replied, watching a column pass, "These men already have theirs." German rear guards attempted to slow the advance with demolitions and ambushes. In places where resistance fighters had mapped enemy positions, information was passed directly to American officers without ceremony. A former French lieutenant handed over a sketch map and said, "They will try to hold the crossroads." The officer nodded and moved on. In Chartres, veterans of the old army stood beside younger men who had never known a France at peace. They listened as American guns fired on the outskirts, then fell silent. A former infantryman said, "If they move through here, Paris is no longer alone." No one corrected him. Patton's pace created its own pressure. Supply officers argued for restraint. Frontline commanders reported opportunities that would vanish if they slowed. The movement continued, driven by the belief that delay would give the enemy time to recover. French veterans recognized the risk, even as they welcomed the outcome. A man who had fought at Verdun said, "Speed breaks fear. It also breaks men." He watched ambulances move as quickly as tanks. As city followed city, the question shifted from whether liberation would come to how far it would go before resistance hardened. The answers were not yet clear. The roads remained crowded. The orders kept coming. And the veterans who watched understood that this advance was only beginning to test its limits. The advance did not slow after Chartres. The distance between towns shortened as German units fell back in uneven order, sometimes fighting, sometimes abandoning positions without contact. American columns adjusted routes on the move. Roads not marked on maps became axes of advance. French civilians pointed, gestured, and stepped aside without being asked. In Orleans, veterans of the 1940 campaign stood near the lower bridges as engineers inspected charges that had failed to detonate. One former captain ran his hand along the stone parapet and said, "They would have destroyed this 4 years ago." Another answered, "They no longer have the time." Reports filtered through the towns faster than official announcements. Patton's name was spoken often, not with ceremony, but as a fact. His tanks were in Le Mans yesterday. They crossed here before dawn. Each statement carried disbelief sharpened by memory. The occupation had taught people to expect delay, negotiation, retreat. This movement offered none. German counterattacks appeared without coordination. A column might be struck on one road, while another passed unopposed 5 kilometers away. French resistance fighters guided American units around known strong points. A veteran of the old cavalry, now serving as a courier, said to an American major, "They are strong where you expect them to be weak." The major adjusted his route and did not ask why. In Auxerre, former soldiers gathered as prisoners were marched west. The sight was familiar but reversed. One man said, "We walked that way once." Another replied, "Not like this." The prisoners looked confused rather than defeated, as if the speed had denied them a proper retreat. Patton's headquarters pushed for crossings, junctions, and rail hubs in rapid sequence. Decisions were made with partial information and accepted without revision. Fuel shortages threatened to halt forward units, then were resolved hours later by convoys diverted at risk. French veterans recognized the pattern. Momentum was being treated as a resource. In towns bypassed by the main thrust, people waited, uncertain whether liberation had truly arrived. In those passed through, it was undeniable. American units did not linger. There were no speeches. A brief exchange, a direction pointed out, then movement resumed. Veterans noted the absence of ceremony. One said, "This is how you end a war, not how you begin one." As the advance approached the Seine crossings, resistance stiffened. Artillery fire became more deliberate. German units fought to hold ground long enough to extract remnants. French observers listened to the guns and counted the intervals. A former sergeant said, "They are trying to buy time." No one believed they had much to spend. Patton's insistence on pressure forced choices on both sides. For the French veterans watching, the meaning was clear. The liberation unfolding was not cautious or balanced. It was driven, uneven, and accelerating toward a confrontation that would not allow pause. The question now was whether speed alone could carry it through the next barrier. The crossings over the Seine did not collapse the way German planners expected. Bridges fell in some sectors and held in others, but the delay never aligned across the front. Units that stalled were bypassed. Units that crossed pushed east without waiting for flanks to settle. French veterans watching from embankments recognized the risk. In 1940, gaps had been fatal. Now the gaps were intentional. At Sens, an old artillery officer traced the map lines in the dirt with a stick and said, "This should not work." A younger man answered, "It works because they do not stop to make it safe." The comment spread among those listening. Speed was no longer an advantage. It was the method. German commands attempted to reestablish coherence. Orders arrived late and contradicted one another. Local commanders chose between holding ground and preserving forces. Many chose withdrawal, only to find American armor already across their routes. Prisoners spoke of columns dissolving into fragments, each acting on its own judgment. French veterans heard the accounts and noted the absence of confidence. Patton's headquarters accepted reports without polishing them. If a road was open, it was used. If resistance appeared heavier than expected, pressure shifted rather than paused. This approach unsettled Allied planners trained to synchronize advances. French observers compared it to cavalry raids of another century, updated with engines and radios. In Troyes, a former infantry lieutenant spoke with an American captain over a folded map. "You are leaving space behind you," he said. The captain replied, "If they fill it, we turn back later." The answer carried no emphasis. It was treated as obvious. The liberation of towns continued in rapid succession, but the tone changed. Civilians now spoke of the next town before the current one had settled. Veterans understood what that meant. The front was no longer a line, but a direction. German resistance hardened where terrain allowed delay. Forests and rivers became points of friction rather than barriers. As Patton's forces pressed deeper, the strain showed. Vehicles broke down and were abandoned without ceremony. Units fought on reduced fuel and ammunition. French veterans saw this and waited for the hesitation that had always followed such conditions. It did not come. Instead, orders emphasized initiative. Battalion commanders made decisions that would once have required approval from above. Some succeeded. Others failed and were absorbed by the movement behind them. The advance did not acknowledge individual outcomes. By the time resistance thickened near the next major axis, veterans sensed a turning point approaching. Speed had carried the operation beyond expectation. Now it demanded a decisive outcome. Either the pressure would fracture what remained of German control, or the lack of consolidation would be exploited. No one watching believed the moment could be delayed. The pressure converged near the Belgian border, where roads narrowed and traffic thickened. What had been momentum now required decision under constraint. Columns that had advanced freely were forced to choose priority. Armor waited on infantry. Infantry waited on fuel. Air support was requested, and sometimes denied by weather. French veterans following the advance understood the danger of compression. This was where advances had failed before. German resistance stiffened around crossroads and wooded ridges. Anti-tank guns were dug in with care. Mines appeared where none had been expected. Progress slowed to measured gains rather than leaps. Reports reaching Patton described rising losses and stalled spearheads. The reaction was not withdrawal, but reorientation. Pressure shifted again, this time deliberately, forcing German units to respond across multiple points at once. At a captured command post, French veterans read abandoned orders scattered across a table. They spoke quietly among themselves. The language showed urgency without clarity. Units were told to hold and move in the same paragraph. One veteran folded the paper and said, "They no longer know which matters more." American units pushed through lesser roads, accepting higher risk to avoid predictable axes. Tanks advanced without waiting for perfect coordination. When resistance halted them, artillery was brought forward immediately rather than later. The tempo did not return to its earlier pace, but it never stopped. A French mechanic repairing a damaged Sherman near a village square watched the crews work through the night. He said to another veteran, "They repair only enough to move." The other answered, "Because stopping is more dangerous than moving broken." The exchange reflected what many had begun to accept. By the time the fighting reached the heart of Belgium, German formations were no longer operating as a unified force. They reacted instead of planned. Counterattacks were launched and repelled within hours. Gains were made and lost, but the overall direction remained unchanged. Each mile forward reduced the enemy's ability to coordinate the next response. Patton's insistence on continuous action now showed its cost. Supply lines were stretched thin. Commanders argued over priorities. Allied coordination grew tense. Yet French veterans noticed something that outweighed the strain. German movements no longer threatened a reversal. They aimed only to slow what could not be stopped. As night fell in the most contested sector, firing continued without pause. The decision was no longer about whether the advance would continue, but how much resistance could still be extracted from an enemy already fractured. The outcome would not hinge on a single engagement, but on endurance measured in hours rather than days. By the time the pressure eased, the pattern was clear to those who had watched from the beginning. The liberation did not end with a single breakthrough or ceremonial moment. It ended when resistance thinned to isolated actions that no longer altered the direction of movement. Towns were secured not because they were fought over, but because the forces opposing them had already been displaced elsewhere. French veterans moved through streets that were intact but exhausted. They spoke with American soldiers who could not name the last town they had slept in. Dates blurred. Directions mattered more than locations. One veteran remarked that this was the opposite of 1940, when every position had been defended until it collapsed. Now positions were left behind before they could become decisive. German prisoners confirmed what had been suspected. Orders had lost authority as soon as they arrived. Units acted on fragments of information, often outdated. Attempts to regroup failed because the regrouping points were already under pressure. The advance did not give time for repair. Patton's role was discussed quietly rather than celebrated openly. French veterans did not describe speeches or symbols. They spoke of insistence. When others measured risk, he measured opportunity. When caution suggested delay, he chose movement. The method did not eliminate cost, but it denied the enemy recovery. In the days that followed, coordination stabilized. Supply caught up. Lines were drawn again, but farther east than expected. Allied forces consolidated positions that had seemed impossible to hold only weeks earlier. The speed that had unsettled planners now defined the new reality. French veterans gathered in cafes reopened without ceremony. They compared notes, traced routes on maps, and agreed on one point without debate. The liberation of cities in succession had not been a series of isolated victories. It had been a continuous refusal to pause. That refusal had broken the rhythm the enemy depended on. When asked later how it felt to watch it unfold, one veteran answered simply, "It did not look careful. It looked necessary." No one corrected him.